So we have something. You can see it settles into it after the first 48 frames or so. And we've got a cool wave shapes here from the general shape of our trough. But, we want it to be way more turbulent than that. We're going to want to have like boulders and stuff on the sides for it to run into. And we'll probably want to have some rocks in the water itself to run up against and actually create some whitewater. So let's go ahead and do that. Drop down another geometry node here. We'll call it rocks, because that's what they are. And we'll make it green, because that makes it run faster. And let's go into there. So now, I'm going to say hide other objects for a minute. Object merge in the ground. I want to paint areas on the ground to say scatter rocks here. So to do that, paint. Now paint by default wants to actually paint the CD color attribute. So change that to an arbitrary attribute, density. If we go and click on this, we go into the actual, there we go, strange. We can actually like draw on here now, which is nice. If you shift middle click and drag, you can make it bigger, like so. And if you go up against the edge, you can have it shoot down the side, which we don't want. So go also on the paint stop here, brush angle, give it some tiny number, and now it won't do that anymore. Now we could probably come up with a procedural way of doing this, but we don't really need to. Let's just paint along the side here, and on the top a little bit too. This again is going to be where our actual boulders and such will be procedurally generated. We can add our own, and we will add our own in addition to this later. But for now, this is a good place to start. So, come back. Let's actually go to scatter. And again, let's use that brand new scatter attribute by turning on density attribute here. Density is a default. How convenient. Turn off the force total count, and let's just up the density scale here. So apparently we have about 700 rocks that we're going to have. You might have more or less. It just depends on how much area you actually ended up painting. So your result will be a little bit different than mine no matter what. So I'm going to put a sphere down. Later on we'll give it actually points to deform to make them actually look like rocks. But for now, basic sphere is fine. So copy to points, and let's take a look at that. Okay, hard to see what's going on there. They're pretty big. And we're going to randomize these sizes, and we'll make them smaller at the same time. So we want to randomize the P scale, particle scale. That's what copy to points uses to say how big the sphere should be when it's put there. It is a one-dimensional attribute, not a vector. And we want this to be, we use a ramp so that we can actually say, hey, I actually want to have like more big ones, or I want to have less big ones than small ones. So something like that. It doesn't have to be too exact, but something to the effect of a ramp that goes up at the very end. At the same time, we want this to be way smaller. So 0.5 gets us that. 0.1 brings those back. We don't want any like actually totally gone rocks. So this is a nice kind of, big boulders with lots of little ones kind of clustered in between them. We can also help this out a little bit. Make it a little bit smaller. We can help us out a little bit by doing a relax. Point relax will take the P-scale attribute and in 3D space push them away from each other. Now that looks terrible because now they're flying off the ground. You recall the ground looked like this. Oh, looks like our source is still on or something. Anyway, so we don't want that. Fortunately, relax has a second input where you can give it polygon geometry, and when it moves it, it kind of slides it along the surface. So now we can see they're still attached to the surface. So that's pretty cool too. Now let's give the spheres some resolution by going to polygon, up the frequency to 10 or something. And so now they'll actually have points on the surface that we can apply mountain to. We can use our new favorite, I should say, Whirly Cellular. And we have a problem. All of these dark ones are inside out because the mountain is trying to move the points up to 1 unit. And if these spheres aren't even a unit long, or wide, in diameter I should say, then a lot of them are getting flipped inside out. So instead of doing it en masse like this, where we're applying the mountain to everything at once, let us instead do this per point, where we can do a different mountain operation each time. So let's do it for each point on this, and say, let's have the mountain happen while the sphere is still big, while it's still, 1 unit in radius. So we deform it, then we copy it to all the points. That's cool, but they all look the same. So now I should say, honestly, now let's do it per point, where we say the mountain has this thing here called time. When we change the time, we get a different result. So instead of being content with them all being identical, within this for loop, we can click Create Meta Import Node, and it will have, in each iteration of the for loop, this iteration detail attribute will be whatever the current iteration of the for loop is. We'll just use that value here, so that on each iteration, it is giving us a differently deformed sphere. So say detail, point to that for metadata thing. The attribute is iteration, and 0 because it's a one-dimensional attribute, not a vector. So now if we look at the result of this, it's going to take longer to do, because now it actually has to do something different every time. And we get this. This is pretty good. The only thing that I don't love about this is that all the small ones have the same kind of frequency, or at least depth, as the big ones. So it still feels a little off. And I know we shouldn't spend a lot of time on making this not very photoreal looking environment anyway, but this is an easy enough thing to address, so let's just do it. So we created these p-scales that go from point 1 to point 4. What if, in addition to the overall deformation being different, let's also drive the height in a similar way? We could try just doing, we can say we have the p-scale per point here at the beginning of the for loop where we're looking at an individual point. So we could say, and this might just work, but I don't think it will. We can say point, much like the detail attribute, let's point this time to the beginning of the for loop, not the metadata one. Say give me point 0, because there is only one point per for loop iteration. Give me that p-scale attribute, and again, it's a one-dimensional attribute. So now, the smaller it is, the smaller the actual height deformation will be. And that's not that bad. We could do times 2 to kind of get it back up to, the biggest spheres we know are 0.4, so that the biggest spheres will have a 0.8. This is pretty good. The smaller spheres kind of just look like spheres, though, still, which is kind of a bummer. So while that's not bad, I'm going to say, let's just drive another attribute based off of the results of this p-scale here. So I'm going to put a wrangler down and say, let's make an arbitrary attribute called depth. And we'll fit that p-scale we just made based on whatever the minimum was, which we already know is 0.05, but just in case we change it, to the maximum. So remap that range to some new maximum, or some new minimum, I should say, and some new maximum. So nothing too crazy there. If you need to see the whole thing, as people have told me about previous lessons, they can't always see it. So we're remapping the p-scale in min-max to out min-max. So press this to create all those things. And what we need to do is just drive. There are probably more elegant ways of doing this, but I'm just going to drive based on these. And so instead of it, I'm going to say the smaller ones should get half the height, and the biggest ones should get the full height. Or I mean height here. So let's have this point attribute instead look at depth. So hopefully that looks more interesting and it was worth us taking this little detour. I think it will be, though. So that's cool. That's better. You know, it's not perfect. The whole point of this is that it's not perfect, but I think it looks more interesting than when everything was just crazy without it. Cool. So there you go. So we got rocks. Now, if we change the scatter's seed here, it will scatter the points in a different place, which will cause everything to be different. It will cause the p-scales to be different because they'll be in a different location, so they'll look up into things differently, and then everything will just be different. So let's take a minute and we'll drive the global seed based on the current frame, and if we run a flipbook, it will change the frame for every frame in the flipbook, and we can literally just look at all of them and choose whichever one we like best. I'll explain the criteria essentially that we're looking for when this is done. But I'm going to let this run out maybe several dozen of these, and then we'll reconvene. So this is working. As you can see, we can have our pick of the litter. But I would also say, let's actually stop this for a minute. I want to see the actual liquid surface, you know, the default first frame one anyway, because some of this will be under the water. So we're not really getting maybe a good feeling on this without seeing that. So I'm just going to turn on that box, that first box here. So now you can see it feels very different. So I'm going to say, that's cool. Let's run that flipbook again, and then we will talk about it.